This week on Jerusalem Dateline, tension builds between Israel and Iran over its nuclear program, and the impact is felt up on Israel's northern border. Plus, could Saudi Arabia allow a Christian church in the heart of Islam? And written in stone, the evidence for King David. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. New satellite images reveal Israel is dramatically expanding its secretive nuclear facility at the center of its undeclared atomic weapons program. The photos show a construction site about the size of a soccer field next to Israel's nuclear research center. The facility is home to underground labs that reprocess nuclear material to weapons-grade plutonium. Experts estimate Israel has material for at least 80 atomic bombs. But the main focus now is on Iran's nuclear program. Currently, Iran and the U.S. are locked in a face-off over the Iranian nuclear deal, and Israel is caught in the middle. Iran says economic sanctions must end before any new talks. But the U.S. says Iran must comply with the 2015 nuclear agreement before sanctions are lifted. Recently, Iran raised the stakes, and we went up to the north to see the impact on the Israeli-Lebanese border. Sunday, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog announced Iran will provide less access to its atomic program. The move is a response to U.S. refusal to lift sanctions, which Iran is demanding as a condition to return to the negotiating table. Some warn if negotiations lead to sanctions relief, it would begin a financial chain reaction in the region.
If more money would go to the IRGC, to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, it would mean more money for Hezbollah in Lebanon, more money for Hezbollah in Syria, or the other proxies of Iran in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and more instability in general to the Middle East.
You're already seeing Iran show tremendous aggression. It is increasing rapidly its enrichment of uranium, now to high-level enrichments that, very, very close to bomb-making capacity.
Middle East observer Joel Rosenberg fears negotiations could force Israel to strike first.
That with Biden trying to get back into the nuclear deal, Israel might decide it has to take preemptive military action against Iran's nuclear facilities. And then what would be Iran's counterpunch? Almost certainly it would be by ordering the Hezbollah military to fire its 150,000 or so missiles and rockets here at Israel, which would be devastating.
A war of words has already begun on Israel's northern border. Israel's defense minister Benny Gantz declared Lebanon's ground would tremble if Hezbollah attacked, while Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah boasted his military can hit anywhere in Israel, and that Israel would not see anything like it since the founding of the state. Just days ago, Israel's Air Force launched an exercise that simulated 3,000 strikes on Hezbollah targets within 24 hours.
That's a great capability, and it's a message to Hezbollah. We know where you are, and we will get you.
Israel's military predicted in 2021 that Hezbollah does not want to enter into a full-scale war. But in 2006, the Second Lebanon War began with a small ambush. So they know anything could happen here on the Israeli-Lebanese border.
Here in the north, every small match can fuel a huge explosion.
In another hotspot, the U.S. launched airstrikes in Syria near the Iraqi border to strike targets used by Iranian-backed militia groups. The Pentagon said the strikes were in retaliation for a rocket attack in Iraq earlier this month that killed one civilian contractor and wounded a U.S. service member along with other coalition troops.
We're confident in the target that we went after. We know what we hit. And we're confident that that target was being used by the same Shia militia that conducted the strikes.
Another battle line in the Middle East is the classroom. The United Nations group responsible for overseeing Palestinian refugee education recently stated it had removed violent and anti-Israel content from school text. A new investigation questions that so-called resolution, finding any changes don't go far enough. During 2020, Palestinian children, like many others around the world, couldn't go to school due to COVID-19. During that time, United Nations Relief Works Agency, or UNRWA, produced and provided the students material that went way beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic.
We found that it contains various violations of UN values, of UNESCO standards, and of UNRWA's own principles. These were educational materials which were distributed to over 320,000 Palestinian children across the West Bank and Gaza.
Marcus Sheff leads a group that monitors peace and cultural tolerance in schools. It examined the material sent to those children, and what they found was not good.
The idea that UNRWA, a UN organization, is distributing material which calls on students to defend the motherland with blood, or that glorifies terrorists and directs students to terrorists like Dalal Mughrabi, who is in their materials a role model for young girls, somebody who murdered 38 people, including 13 children on a civilian bus.
This impact group report from January lays out examples found throughout the curriculum. In mathematics, students are asked to write the number of martyrs in the First Intifada. A language studies question asks students to find the preposition in a sentence like, "Jihad is one of the doors to paradise." And in social studies, where Zionist policy is blamed for exhausting Palestinian natural resources.
It was written by UNRWA's teachers. Now, UNRWA's teachers are supposed to be trained in UN values of peace and tolerance.
Following the January impact report, UNRWA admitted to the problem and assured governments it had been addressed. A follow-up study by the impact team, however, shows that was not the case.
Within these materials, we also found hateful material which young people anywhere should not be studying, and certainly not being taught by a UN organization. So, I think what we see here is that, UNRWA is absolutely part of the problem in relation to the incitement of young people in the region.
In one social studies exercise, sixth graders are shown a map of the British Mandate called Palestine that does not include any Israel reference, and told Palestine is the geographical area which extends from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the River Jordan in the east, and from Lebanon and Syria in the north to the Gulf of Aqaba and Egypt in the south. Its location gave it strategic importance, making it coveted by invaders and colonial powers. And there's another problem.
And that is, if you have distributed print materials to 320,000 children, then you found that you had been distributing hateful material. How exactly did UNRWA get those materials back? We have no answer to that.
Former President Trump cut funding to UNRWA because of this kind of incitement in Palestinian schools. President Biden has pledged to resume humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. Sheff maintains the world should expect transparency from any United Nations body, and until UNRWA can prove otherwise, it should be understood the organization teaches hate. Up next, Jewish rabbis in the Gulf states prepare for an influx of Jews from around the world. For the first time, Jewish communities in the Arab Gulf states are joining together. They believe an association will be necessary to handle the needs of an influx of Jewish people from around the world. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has that story.
One of the many impacts of the Abraham Accords is how some Middle Eastern countries are opening up for Israelis to visit. It's also helping Jewish people feel freer to go public. American Rabbi Dr. Eli Abadi, a Lebanese native, and Bahraini Jewish businessman Ibrahim Dawu Nonu are leading the effort to organize for the locals and the expected influx of others.
The Jewish communities in the Gulf are growing, slowly but significantly, especially in the last several months in which pretty much the entire Gulf kind of opened up. And so we have many Jewish tourists, Jewish businessmen and businesswomen who are coming to look for opportunities.
Abadi says as rabbi for the group, he'll nurture the Jewish spiritual life. The group will also oversee practical matters like kosher food and a Jewish religious court to register marriages and settle disputes.
We came to the realization that we need to be prepared for the growth, for the exponential growth of Jewish communities throughout the 6 Gulf countries.
While many point to Israel's diplomatic and economic breakthroughs that began with 2 Persian Gulf countries, Abadi says his group focuses on faith communities.
I think the Abraham Accord, in a sense, opened up a door that was there from before, in which people now may feel more comfortable living and experiencing Jewish life in the open and publicly.
No one knows how many Jewish people live in the Gulf states, but there are an estimated 1,000 Jews living in the United Arab Emirates alone. Huda Nonu, a former ambassador to the United States, says Bahrain has the Gulf's only indigenous Jewish community. Nonu tells CBN News that Jewish families first arrived in the late 1880s and, quote, "Since that time, our community has been part of the fabric of Bahrain society. As a result, we understand the needs of some of the smaller or newer communities in the region." Abadi believes a number of reasons will bring Jews and Israelis to the Gulf states.
Aspect number one is it's just a new frontier for people that have wandered the globe for over 2,000 years, the Jewish people, from place to place.
While business and tourism will also likely be a draw, Abadi sees the Gulf states becoming a safe haven for those fleeing growing anti-Semitism in the West.
You're going to have also people that are, if not running away, but looking for a safer, better place to live than Europe and the United States, given the anti-Semitic incidents that are increasing in number.
Abadi adds if they want to live in Israel, that's understandable, and that the Gulf can serve as a stop on their ultimate trip home. For others, he foresees the balmy Gulf states becoming the new Miami for Europeans and even Israelis, where people can escape winter weather. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
There's another big change in the Gulf. There's no question Saudi Arabia has the furthest to go when it comes to religious freedom, but it's also true few countries can boast the type of change happening in the kingdom. Jennifer Wishon explains.
Christmas trees, even talk of a future Christian church? No, this isn't a fantasy. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is making and considering changes once thought impossible.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is incrementally moving in the right direction.
Johnny Moore, who sits on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, never thought religious liberty in Saudi Arabia was possible. Now he thinks it's inevitable. It's still illegal for Christians to worship publicly, but in recent years, the kingdom's religious police have eased off raiding worship services.
I would love one day, to celebrate Christmas on the Arabian Peninsula. And this year, by the way, they allowed Christmas trees, in the kingdom. And increasingly, the rumors that Saudi Arabia might actually consider having a Christian church, in the kingdom in some capacity. At this point, these are all rumors, but the very fact that they are rumors is significant.
Especially in light of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's aim to reform the kingdom's judicial system, Sharia law based on a strict interpretation of the Quran, one that's not tolerant of other faiths.
Is this a pretty big deal?
For the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to say, no, we're going to have laws like the rest of the world, and we're going to put those laws down on paper. I mean, this is an astonishing reform.
Watchdog groups also point to improvements in the kingdom's school textbooks, removing some hateful references to Jews, Christians, and others.
Increasingly, we're seeing strong leadership throughout the Arab world that is pushing back on extremism and saying it's not enough to stop the extremist. The real way of stopping extremism is raising a generation that doesn't have to fear those who worship differently.
Incremental moves that may one day lead to Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisting on the Arabian Peninsula. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
Up next, CBN's new film, Written in Stone, The Evidence for King David. For those who believe the Bible, King David was the ruler of ancient Israel. But for a long time, skeptics said there was no proof he existed. Now CBN's new documentary, Written in Stone, House of David, examines how archaeologists are finding more and more evidence of that biblical kingdom.
The Bible records David's story in great detail, from his childhood as a shepherd in Bethlehem to his death in the royal palace of Jerusalem. But for centuries, the Bible was the only evidence that David existed. For a group of so-called minimalist historians, the biblical record wasn't enough. One Bible professor even compared David to the mythical King Arthur.
They said, well, the biblical tradition has been written only in the Hellenistic period. Everything is legend, and no David, no Solomon, and no kingdom of Judah, no temple in Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. They said the Bible is mythology, nothing is true. But then came the Tel Dan Stela.
20 miles east of the Dead Sea, in what is now Jordan, a stone tablet, or stela, was discovered in 1868. The inscription on the stone dates to around 840 BC, less than 200 years after David's rule. It was written by a Moabite king named Mesha, an enemy of Israel. And it contains the first known reference to the house of David outside the Bible. On the stone, Mesha talks about being taxed by and later rebelling against the house of David. A story also recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3. The same phrase, house of David, turned up on another stone more than a century later, this time in northern Israel, in the ruins of a city known as Tel Dan.
The shadow of Mount Hermon, the Dan River comes out, and there's an ancient city there with mud brick arches close to 4,000 years old from the time of Abraham, and with remains from the time of the kings of Judah, including a high place where idols were served. That's an event mentioned in the Bible.
In 1993, Israeli archaeologists found an inscription near the remains of the city gates. Written in the 9th century BC, the Tel Dan Stela is believed to be the earliest non-biblical mention of David.
The king who writes that down is Hazael, and he actually brags. He's bragging to his friends all around, I have succeeded Yehoram, the Jewish king from the house of David. In order for him to succeed over a Jewish king from the house of David, there needs to be a fight with a house of David. And we know Yehoram because Yehoram actually exists in the house of David from the 9th century BCE. This still is amazing because it's something like 80 years after King David has passed away. So there is already a dynasty, and you find it in Israel. The significance is that he has been recognized by another king who actually talks about fighting with him.
It was such a traumatic event that it's recorded in the Stela and also in the Bible.
The stele coming from Tel Dan was a big wow, and it actually proved for the first time the existence of the dynasty of King David, which was back then a challenge.
So you cannot claim anymore that King David is a mythological figure. In this moment, the mythological paradigm collapsed. A few years later came the law chronology paradigm. This guy said, okay, there was David, but he was only a Bedouin sheikh living in a tent. And in his period, there were no fortified cities, no administration, no writing, no central authority. And then came Khirbet Kayafa excavation.
Up next, despite COVID-19 restrictions, the Jewish people continue the celebration of Purim. Purim is usually a festive holiday celebrating the Jewish people's victory over a wicked power broker who wanted to annihilate them, as told in the book of Esther. But now, just 3 weeks after the third lockdown ended, the Israeli government slapped a nighttime curfew on its citizens for the Purim holiday weekend in an attempt to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Before the curfew, you could see people in masks and costumes, but Purim has been celebrated by the Jewish people for thousands of years. We thought it would be good to take a look at how Purim is usually celebrated in a non-COVID year. The celebration of Purim is a reminder that the God of Israel watches over his people. Empires have come and gone, but the Jewish people remain. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And you can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blasts so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time.